You can access both the estimated and actual execution plans. An estimated plan is what the query optimizer comes up with without executing the query. This is useful in cases where the query, by its nature, is long-running, either because the actions it performs are complex, or it's operating on tables with enormous numbers of rows. And then an actual execution plan is, as the name implies, the plan used to execute the query, representing the actual steps taken. In reality, estimated and actual plans don't usually differ all that much. But an estimated plan often can't give you complete information about query execution. There are various situations where this might be the case. If a query batch creates any temporary objects used later in the batch, SQL Server can't optimize a query that uses those objects because they don't exist before the query executes. Another situation is dynamic SQL, since there are just too many unknowns about what form the statement will take until the query batch executes. And this is one of many downsides of using dynamic SQL statements. Both estimated and actual plans in SQL Server 2012 are available in three formats: text, XML, and graphically. The text format is deprecated and will disappear in some future version of SQL Server, so you really should avoid using them. XML is really the only format returned by SQL Server, and the graphical plan viewer in Management Studio uses that XML to display the plan in a more human-readable form. But you can work directly with the XML if you want to. You can control whether SQL Server returns an XML execution plan for any query batches that you execute using a couple of set options. Both of these set options remain in effect for the duration of the session or until you change them again. You can use the Show Plan XML option to turn estimated plans on and off. All right, so if I go in here and execute that statement, all right, and then I come down here. This is just a query against the AdventureWorks database, nothing fancy. Has a having clause and a correlated subquery and so forth. But I can execute that. And notice that I don't get any results from the query. The query itself is going to return information from the product table, but the query didn't execute because I set Show Plan XML on, which is only going to generate an estimated plan without executing the query. Okay, and so there I have the XML representation. We'll take a look at that XML and the execution plan shortly. Okay, so I'll go ahead and turn off estimated plans and turn actual plans on. And I do that using Set Statistics XML on. So definitely some weird naming thing here because I'm not really turning on and off statistics. I'm turning on and off whether or not I'm going to get the actual execution plan. All right, so I'll go ahead and execute that and execute the query once again. And this time I get results back because when I get the actual execution plan, it executes the query. And then I have access to that execution plan right there. Now, one caution about these statements, the Show Plan XML and the Statistics XML. If Show Plan XML is on and you attempt to set Statistics XML to on, the statement isn't going to execute. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. First, I'm going to turn the actual plans off. Okay, whoops. Got a little wild there with the mouse. Okay, so now I'm going to once again turn estimated plans on. I'll execute that. But say that I wanted to also get the actual plans. I might attempt to execute this statement right here, but all I get is the execution plan for this statement. So hopefully you understand that. So I'm always going to get estimated plans. It's not going to execute the query. So this statement didn't execute. Instead, I got the estimated plan to execute this statement. Okay, so just be aware of that little interaction between these statements. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that back off and turn actual back on. Okay, so that time the statement executed because I had turned estimated plans off. Okay, so that's how you can turn on the two different kinds of plans. If I come back down here and execute this query again, once again I get the results because I've turned on the actual plan, and I can click on the XML value here Just like any XML that's returned by SQL Server within Management Studio, I can click on it. Typically, when I click on it, I'll get the raw XML. But because SQL Server recognizes that this XML is the definition of an execution plan, it goes ahead and opens up the graphical representation of that execution plan. Now, if you really want to view the XML for the plan, then you can come in here and right-click and show execution plan XML. And then now you can scroll through the XML and examine all of the things that it does. Okay, I'm not going to dive into that, and I'll close down that, and I won't save that. Okay. Now, within Management Studio, there's a few different ways to turn execution plans on and off. And this is the way you're probably going to most typically do it as you're writing queries and you want to see the execution plans. So the first option here is when I have a query editor open, I can come to Query and select Display Estimated Execution Plan or Include Actual Execution Plan. Now when I select either of those, then it's essentially using those same set statements that I showed you before, and any queries are either going to not execute and just show the estimated execution plan, or it's going to execute the query and include the actual execution plan. Okay, so if I go ahead and turn that on, there it goes ahead and displays the item, and I don't get any results because it didn't execute the query. On the other hand, if I'll go ahead and include the actual execution plan, nothing seems to happen, but now when I execute the query, I get this additional tab that shows that execution plan. Okay, now the way to turn those options on and off is to come here into the query editor, and then I have display estimated execution plan and include actual execution plan. So I have the same options as from the query menu. And then finally, there's a couple of toolbar buttons here. One's right there, which is include the actual execution plan. You can see that that's currently toggled on because I set that setting. And then there's the one for the display estimated execution plan. Okay, so that's how you can just turn them on. For the most part, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference whether you're going to look at the estimated execution plan or the actual execution plan. But the actual plan will have more specific numbers about what happened during the execution of the query. If you really have a problematic query and you really need to dive down and look at precise numbers, generally you're going to want to use the actual execution plan. Just be aware that it could take some time to generate it because it's going to execute the query as well. So if it's a long-running query, then you may have to sit and wait a while for it. All right, so let's take a look at the actual execution plan itself. The execution plan, at least the graphical display of it that I'm showing you here, displays the physical operators that are going to be used, or in this case used, during query execution. The way you read this is to read the plan from right to left and top to bottom. So in this case, the plan starts with a couple of clustered index scans. So those are ways of accessing the data, in this case, from a couple of tables. And then you read from right to left on each of the subtrees. So it reads the data. You might see a flashing there. I'm going to talk about this shortly, but you can hover over each of these operators and get some additional information about them. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so then the second step is then it sorts the data, and then it uses a stream aggregate in order to aggregate the data. That's because I have the group by clause here within the query. And then you'll see compute scalar a lot. A lot of time that's some sort of conversion. It doesn't have a cost. Definitely need to pay attention to it, but it's not really important right here. This query uses data from two different tables. Well, really the same table that it has to query twice. So it does another clustered index scan here, sorts it, aggregates it again, and then does a merge join to bring the two data flows together. And then the select is essentially the operator that returns the result set to the calling application. Okay, now each of these operators displays the relative cost of each step in the plan. That's what that cost 0%, cost 9%, cost 1%, cost 27%, and so forth. So those are the relative costs of each of those operators for all of the operators within the plan. And they all add up to 100%. And in fact, you can compare multiple statements simultaneously by executing for an actual plan or displaying an estimated plan, and it'll show the relative costs between the two queries as well. But in this case, I only had a single query highlighted, so the total is 100%. Now, all of these costs are not monetary amounts. It's not something that Microsoft is going to ding you based on the queries that you execute. Instead, the cost is an indicator of the amount of time and the resource usage that each step consumes. So sorting data is very expensive. So as you can see, the sort operators within this plan combine to 54% of the overall cost of the query. Sorting is very expensive. So the nice thing about the cost is it gives you a benchmark to use so that you can focus on the most expensive operators. Because if you can make improvements to those, then that is going to have the biggest impact on improving query efficiency. So there may be another way to write this query that avoids needing to sort the data. Or maybe I need another index on the table that would avoid that need. Okay, so there's various things that you can do in response when you see that sort of an operator dominating a plan like that. Okay, now we also have these arrows. The arrows indicate the flow of data from one operator to another. The relative thickness of each arrow indicates the relative amount of data that's moving between the operators. And you can also hover over that operator, the arrow operator, to see the actual number of rows as compared to the estimated number of rows. Keep in mind that this is the actual execution plan, and so it's able to display the actual number of rows that moved from the sort operator to the stream aggregate operator. Okay, then I mentioned this information box, so I'm hovering over this merge join operator. So this shows both the physical and logical operations that are used in a plan. So in this case, the query that this plan is based on has a correlated subquery, which is logically an inner join. And so the physical operator that I'm hovering over here is the merge join. Now the number of rows was estimated to be 83.1195. And that's based on the current statistics for the table. But the actual number of rows, a little bit higher in the box, I can't move the mouse, otherwise the box will disappear, but a little bit higher, you can see the actual number of rows was 119. The difference between this estimated number of rows and the actual number of rows may indicate stale statistics. Although, as a practical matter, in a table this small, it's not going to make all that much of a difference. But in a larger table, if you have a large discrepancy in the estimated versus actual, SQL Server may have come up with an execution plan that was based on the estimated number, but there may actually be a better plan if it knew that there was going to be a significantly higher or lower number of rows. So that's something to watch out with execution plans. All right, now the information box also shows the cost of this operator as well as the cost of the execution subtree up to this point. Okay, so you can work with those numbers. For example, you could hover over the select operator instead, get what the total cost of that subtree is. So you can see that the estimated subtree cost is 0.069217. And you can come over to another point in the subtree and compare that cost with the overall cost and start to get information about relative efficiencies of subtrees. So you can look at individual operators, you can look at subtrees or branches of the execution plan, or you can look at the overall plan in order to get a feel for how it's performing. Okay, and you can get even more information about each of these operations by selecting it within the Query Designer and pressing F4 to open up the Properties window. And so this has some additional information, and you can drill down into different levels, and some have additional information that's hidden. Okay, so a lot of the same information as the information window, as well as a little bit more.